Let me guess. You must be Xerxes.
So that is the Hollywood version of King Xerxes of the Persian Empire. That's a clip from the movie 300. So in this video, we'll be talking about the Persian empires, and Xerxes was a king during the Achaemenid Empire, and that's the empire that we're going to focus mainly on. So the big questions you need to be able to answer after watching this video is, how did the Persian Achaemenids build one of the world's first empires? And second, how does the Hollywood version of the Persians compare with reality? So let's start with that first big question. How did the Persian Achaemenids build one of the world's first empires? So the Achaemenids really create the template for empire that almost all future empires are going to model their empire after. So the Persians built a massive empire that spanned 3 continents: Asia, Eastern Europe, and North Africa. So classical Persia begins with the formation of this Achaemenid Empire right around 600 BCE, and that's one of the reasons why 600 BCE is chosen as one of those key turning point moments for purposes of AP World History, because this is really the beginnings of empire on a fairly grand scale, because you had regions like Persia and Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Anatolian Peninsula, parts of Macedonia, parts of the Arabian Peninsula, Armenia, Egypt, all part of this massive empire. So the Achaemenids ruled this vast empire that included almost all of the modern Middle East, and as a result, it's an extremely diverse empire. Many different languages that would have been spoken in this particular region, lots of different religions practiced. As we'll see, the main state religion was a religion known as Zoroastrianism, but you had other religious traditions within the empire. Jews were living in the region at the time. Many people still practiced polytheistic worship of localized deities. So when it comes to the sort of modern geography, when we think about the word Persia, I want you to start associating it with a modern country, which is this one right here, Iran. So when people tell you that they're Persian, most likely they are from Iran, and that's because the capital of the Persian empires were mainly located within the modern day boundaries of Iran. So for example, in the Achaemenid Empire, their capital was Persepolis. So when we're discussing the template for empire, one of the critical characteristics is that you need to have a strong leader. And in the case of the Achaemenids, their strong leader was...
His name is Cyrus, aka Cyrus the Great.
So Cyrus the Great was the founder of the Achaemenid Empire. One of the famous artifacts that came out of the Persian Empire was this Cyrus's cylinder. So now I want you to pause the video and read this passage. So what conclusions can we make about Cyrus the Great based on at least this passage? So one thing that we can state is, Cyrus, not only was he a great military leader and conqueror, but he also recognized that it wasn't enough to just conquer territory, that he then had to bring together and unify people. And one way that Cyrus did that was by making people like him. And one thing that he did when he conquered Mesopotamia, for example, was he freed Jewish slaves. So Cyrus has a very good rep in the Old Testament because of the things that he did in freeing the Jewish people and allowing them to then return to their holy land. Now, as I mentioned before, the Achaemenid Empire served as a model for all future empires in the way they unified such vast land with a lot of different diverse people. Now, how did they do this? First, they created an imperial bureaucracy. Now, that term bureaucracy is going to be really important in AP World History in terms of understanding state building, how governments form, and how they're able to fulfill all these functions. So a bureaucracy is a system for administering a large government. In the United States, we have lots of different agencies, like the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Education. Those are all part of our bureaucracy. We also have governments at different levels. Like, not only do we have the federal government, but we have state government, local government. All of those are systems that are designed to make the functions of the state run smoothly and effectively. So in the Persian Empire, they developed a system called the satraps. And what the satraps were they were actually governors who ran local affairs and ultimately collected taxes on behalf of the king. So the king recognized, look, I can't do everything. I need to, in such a large empire, I need to be able to have things run smoothly in different regions of the empire. And so they delegated authority to these satraps, who then collected taxes and ran things on the more local level. So we would consider these are sort of the equivalent of governors in the United States. Now let's take a look at a burial tomb from one of the Persian kings. Pretty cool, built into the side of the mountain in modern-day Iran. And so if we look at this relief image, you see at the very top the Persian king, also sometimes referred to as the Great King, the King of Kings, the king in Persian, the king in countries. Next to the king right here is the god of Zoroastrianism. So you can see he's kind of floating above the ground, indicative of some divine status. Now, who do you think all of these people are down here? And your first response may be like slaves or laborers, but they're holding up the king. And they're in very close proximity. So those are actually the satraps, or these governors of the various provinces. So I don't know about you, but if I was the king and I was living far away, I might have some concerns about the way in which these satraps are collecting my taxes. And therefore, one of the things that you can put in place as part of the bureaucracy is a network of spies to ensure that the satraps were performing their functions and not, skimming a little bit off the top. So the Persians developed this network of spies, which basically served as the eyes of the Persian king in all of these distant territories. So another thing the Persians did to tie their empire together was they built a road connecting their empire. So they began developing these large public infrastructure projects, roads being one of them. And this was critical for increasing transportation and trade across their empire. They also, along this road, developed a postal system. So they had various people that were positioned in about 20 miles apart on horses. They then could take a message from one end of the empire to the other very quickly. And so they developed the first postal system, a role that government still plays to this day. They also were very tolerant of conquered people's religions, as we saw in the case of Cyrus the Great. They recognized, because they have a very diverse population, people practicing lots of different religions, they wanted to be able to recognize that, and ultimately that gave them some greater legitimacy or power. They also developed standardized systems. For instance, they developed metallic coins, which then could be used throughout the empire, which ultimately increased trade. Now, the Achaemenid Empire, like all other empires, eventually is going to collapse, and it's really due to external invasion that the Achaemenid Empire collapses. Alexander the Great is going to come in and conquer the Persian Achaemenid Empire and the formation of the Macedonian Empire, and we'll come back to this later on in a later video. Now, Alexander's empire is going to split apart, and there are going to be later empires that are going to form within this region of Persia. So be aware of this, just recognize their names. We have the Seleucids from 312 to 63 BCE. We have the Parthians from 63 BCE to 224 CE. And then finally, the one we're going to come in contact with again are the Sassanids from 224 CE to 651 CE. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on these later Persian empires, but for purposes of this course, you just need to be able to recognize these names, the Seleucids, the Parthians, and the Sassanids, and say, oh, those are examples of Persian empires. So another way in which we unify empires is through trade. And so the Persian Empire was in a really geographically blessed location when it came to Eurasian trade. So this Silk Road was starting to form across Eurasia, and the Persians really held a central spot on that trade network. And when you hold a central spot on a trade network, you have an advantage because you can impose taxes on merchants who are passing through that region. Now, in terms of their interaction with the environment, the Persians were experiencing all of these expansion of crops into the Middle East. Now, we talked about the Fertile Crescent being an excellent place to domesticate localized plants and animals, but when it comes to Iran is a little drier, a little more arid, but we're seeing the spread of crops into that region, so they needed to develop new irrigation techniques in order to provide water to be able to grow the plants that they needed to grow. Now, how are you going to do this? Well, they're going to develop a pretty innovative technology known as a qanat. And what a qanat does is it is basically a tunnel that's built into the side of a mountain that allows access to a water table through a series of vertical access shafts. Water will then flow out this qanat channel and then ultimately provide irrigation for the plain down below the mountain range. So that creates an irrigated area. So these qanats, these underground tunnels used in irrigation, are examples of ways in which humans are making alterations or changes to their environment, impacting their environment in order to provide farmland. Now, in terms of their cultural characteristics, we mentioned already that the Persians practiced a state religion known as Zoroastrianism. It was founded by a prophet called Zarathustra, or sometimes referred to as Zoroaster. So when we talk about prophets in this class, we're talking about people who claim to have a direct relationship with God, who have communicated directly with God. So Zoroastrianism is considered one of the earliest monotheistic traditions, along with Judaism, those two religions founded around the same time. Now, I put a question mark next to monotheism because there are some questions about whether this counts as monotheism. So in Zoroastrianism, there's this ongoing battle between a good god named Ahura Mazda, who's responsible for everything that's good in the world, and the evil god Angra Mainyu. And so we can consider this a monotheistic tradition because there's only one single good God. In Zoroastrianism, they developed the concept of the Judgment Day, that moral souls would ascend into heaven, and that if you were immoral during your lifetime, you'd go to hell. Now, this is important because this is going to play a huge influence on contemporary monotheistic traditions like Judaism, or later monotheistic traditions like Christianity or Islam. So if you're Christian and you've heard the nativity story, you might have heard about the three wise men or kings, but in the original translation, they're referred to as the Magi. And Magi actually is a reference to Zoroastrian priests. Zoroastrianism, many students ask, well, do people still practice Zoroastrianism today? Yes, but very few. The most famous Zoroastrian probably ever was Freddie Mercury from the band Queen.
Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? Caught in a landslide, no escape from reality.
Speaking of reality, the last question that I want us to get back to was that question we started the video with. How does the Hollywood version of the Persian Empire in the movie 300 compare to reality? So hopefully you've seen throughout the course of this video that the Persians developed a template for empire in creating unity among diverse people, developing systems of bureaucracy, developing common currency, being tolerant of religions. So why does the Hollywood version not square with the reality? Well, as you can see from the depiction of Xerxes, they wanted to create someone who was alien, who was foreign, who was scary, evil looking, because you want to create this juxtaposition of good versus evil. And when we're talking about history, it's important to always recognize perspective. So when it comes to the Persian Empire, I told you at the beginning, Persia is associated with what modern day country? Iran. Are we friends with Iran? No. Therefore, our view of Iranian history is a little bit more disparaging. All right, so as a result of watching this video, I hope you can answer these two big questions. How did the Persians develop one of the world's first true empires? And how does the Hollywood version of the Persians compare with reality? Thanks for watching.